Really pleased to be talking today to Sheila Mulvenney, the author of our book, Overcoming Barriers to Learning. This is a book that Sheila wrote when she was in the middle of a career as an interim virtual school head, but she has many other different parts to her career. Sheila, it'd be nice to start off with, can you tell us how you even arrived in education? That would be interesting.
Okay. Yes, when I sort of left school, I was determined to be a nurse. Lots of people tried to persuade me to do other things because I'd actually just kind of done quite well at school. So people were saying, go and do a degree and this sort of thing. But actually, I'd always wanted to be a nurse, and I felt it was such a practical job that I wanted to train on the job. So although there were options way back when in those days to do a degree in nursing, it wasn't something I wanted, and I loved nursing, really enjoyed it. And from then I went on into health visiting for all the wrong reasons, really, because it was just I was married to a teacher at the time, and nursing, I did intensive care unit nursing, and so that was on a constant rotation of nights and days, and it just didn't allow for a lot of life. So I went to teach, I went to train as a health visitor, which meant a year in college doing things like psychology, which are relatively new for me, and became fascinated. I guess that was when I first became interested in attachment, working with sort of some quite needy families. Sort of seeing children being taken to care, first times being subpoenaed into court and things like that. So I guess that's where my journey kind of started in terms of ending up working with children with care. So I did that for quite a lot of years, and then went to work in further education college, actually, for people that were doing childcare teaching, usually mature students to start with, teaching on childcare and care management courses. And I worked there for a long time and became very interested in the whole, at that time we had a lot of students who were quite unmanageable at school coming into further education colleges at kind of 14. And that just, I became very fascinated by them, you know, why they just didn't seem able to behave. They were lovely kids, but they had no notions of kind of, I suppose, self-control and things like that. So that started me being quite interested in that, and also in phonics, which I'm still very interested in. And the fact that these kids could spend 10 years at school and come out and still couldn't read, which had such an impact on them. So from there, I went to do my PGCE, train as a teacher, and went to work in schools. Range of schools, but quite quickly I was drawing into kind of specialist provisions, particularly SEMH, social emotional mental health, which back in the day we called EBD. So started we changed the labels, but actually the children often suffering from it, you know, they're experiencing the same things. So worked in there for a while, and from that went to work in local authorities, initially in inclusion departments, around all the children that were at risk of exclusion, and then into sort of behaviour management, supporting schools with behaviour, and then into virtual schools for children with care, children in care, which I've loved, and been head of virtual school in about 5 different local authorities. And you know, they're all different, they all have their own particular demographics and things like that, but actually at its core the children are the same. They are very needy children, and sadly I don't think corporate parenting is able to deliver the service always that young children need. I know it's a bit contentious, but I think we need to be looking long and hard at how we can improve the experience of being a child with a corporate parent, because at the minute I think for an awful lot of children it's just not effective. So yeah, that's
a fascinating journey. Do you think that the eyes of a nurse, Sheila the health visitor, Sheila the lecturer in childcare or early childcare, do you think that those eyes have helped you as a virtual school head?
I think they have. I definitely think they have. And I think because I have got that kind of, I suppose, that range from like early years in terms of doing sort of things like child development right up to further education, teaching adults actually who sometimes still suffer from those same issues in terms of their own sense of self-belief and self-esteem, which it puts such a block on their progress very often. So yeah, I think that has, and also one of the things that you know but others wouldn't know, which I think has impacted me as I get older, I realise it's impacted me more and more, is I have a sister with quite severe learning disabilities. And so that's another area that, you know, that we are not an inclusive society. Every few weeks or months we get a scandal, don't we, of people being abused horrifically, some of our most vulnerable adults. So that's another kind of something I'm really interested in, something I feel that it's got to be shifted in society, our view of adults with disabilities. I mean, I think one of the things that really struck me was almost the I want to say fear, but that feels a bit too strong, the nervousness and anxiety that lots of new parents have, that they won't be able to do the job well, and how that creates often such a tension of them kind of being watched and feeling they're not doing a good job. And actually one of the things that often stops us doing a good job is being watched, isn't it? You know, we feel much more under pressure. So I remember a couple of particular cases. One was a young woman who had a learning disability, loved her baby to bits, but wasn't really able to look after her. Eventually she was, because her sister happened to live up the street, and with masses of support, in fact, she kept the child. That's quite an unusual story. And unfortunately, what we often do is those children are removed. And of course, what we know is the need sometimes for the mother is to have another baby. And then you get this trail of children going. And actually, we just seem to have adopted an approach that says we're better to minimize risk by removing children, when actually what we're not doing is not necessarily minimizing risks. We're just putting another set of risks in, rather than support parents to you know, do a good job and be able to attach. And the other area was a very young mother who herself had been a looked after child. And you know, our record of supporting looked after children, looked after young women to keep their babies, and in fact similarly with the fathers to be involved if they're, you know, young men, it's just not great. And it's like, actually, you know, one of the things we do is we have to observe them looking after their child. Imagine when you're a young, inexperienced, nervous mother, someone watching everything you do, and when you're a young, inexperienced, nervous mother who's still working through their own attachment issues, how terribly hard. So I think it just made me see, gosh, you know, it's jolly tough if you haven't had those good experiences in the past to actually be able to form strong attachments with your child. And I think all the latest work we've had on attachment and on the impact of adversity and trauma, you know, parents are still working through their issues, and how tough to be able to parent when you're still working through your issues. Yeah. And some do a great job, some don't, and that's the nature of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and Heather Geddes, you know, who wrote
Yes.
Attachment in the Classroom, she really lays emphasis on this whole thing about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, that if you have a traumatized parent, how their parenting style will be impacted by the re-triggering of it when they have a helpless baby with them. And how
Absolutely.
that attachment style, the insecurities within that attachment style can be so perpetuated, really, unless something has come along to support, as you say, support
yes,
the parent.
it's support is the key. Absolutely right. Yeah. And I think, as I say, we've become very risk averse, and so we don't want to, if there's a risk, we somehow feel better about sometimes removing the child, and actually all we do is translate to another whole lots of risks, different risks.
More rejections, more
Absolutely
abandonment,
right.
more
Absolutely.
loss.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that that it's not inevitable that the attachment pattern will be repeated, because obviously an adult can have other experiences,
Yes.
or indeed that child growing up can have a grandmother or an
Absolutely.
aunt or an uncle or somebody, or a great teacher, which is where we can come back to education, who could make all the difference in the world. But if it's not picked up early enough, then there is that greater risk, isn't there, of it being passed on to the next generation. Yeah. Okay, great. So my goodness, you got, so this, it was such a diverse background really for thinking about writing this book. So tell us a bit about why you thought it would be useful to have a book at this point in your career. What came together for you to make you want to write one?
Well, I suppose it was about visiting a lot of schools as a virtual head, and working in SEMH environments, and realizing that, you know, there are substantial numbers of children in every class every day that actually are just not in a place to learn. And I think that, you know, that was one of the things in the book that I referred to, is, you know, there could be kind of big reasons, like, for example, a child being taken into care, but then there's lots of other children on given days that could have just had an argument with their parents might have broken up, their grandmother could be ill in hospital, they might have forgotten their PE kit, you know, a whole range of things that means for a time at least, they're not going to be able to get to the point of learning. And I think what I was seeing repeatedly were people minimizing those reasons, and teachers with the best intentions in the world who want the children to learn, and kind of almost trying to push that child to a place of learning. And what was happening was we were pushing them further away, you know, and they were ending up with bigger incidents, ever increasing bigger incidents, because actually the stress and worry they were feeling at the time would mean that they wouldn't be able to concentrate. And if people piled more stress on by getting them to do it, then actually that would, you know, just drive them, as it were, further and set up those quite damaging repeating patterns, where that's what they come to expect of school, particularly for those children who have kind of longer term issues. Yeah, because I think for some it can be very short term. And it's interesting thinking about the situation at the minute. Doing some training with schools, a head teacher was just telling me the other night how he feels there's almost an epidemic of anxiety among his kind of key stage 2 children, who I guess are kind of old enough to maybe hear bits of the news, hear what parents are saying, and have a view on it, whereas maybe the littler ones don't in quite the same way. They might still be picking up anxiety for parents, but they might not be interpreting some of the kind of verbal clues that they're getting. So yeah, I think that was probably one of my motivations, to enable teachers to see that without us doing some bridging work, those children won't ever be able to learn, which is what we see, I think, still. You know, although we have, you know, there are still lots of children excluded that set on a pathway.
Yeah, absolutely. And the earlier we can address that trajectory, the better.
Well, in fact, someone just did a tweet the other day that really just emphasised this. A teacher said she'd noticed one of her little children, I think they were only about 6, was really distracted in maths. And she'd noticed it from the beginning and just couldn't settle to work and was really fidgety. And then she got the rest of the class working, and then she went over and kind of said, you know, what's going on today? And he'd had this horrible dream about his grandfather, I think. So she sat and talked, and I think they ended up writing him a letter, drawing a picture or something like that, and then he settled to his maths. Now, if she'd just gone and said stop fidgeting, which, you know, is so often our response, because, you know, I do utterly understand the pressure that educators are under, you know, especially at the minute, you know, but always that pressure to, you know, ensure children are making progress and all the other things. But it's like something as simple as that, which is really short term, and actually hopefully the next day they've been fine in the next day. And that's the idea of that spectrum of things might be very short term and relatively minor, but we still can't ignore them without further consequences, or through to children where they are maybe living with a parent with mental health issues, you know, and certainly I've had instances where, you know, children have pulled out the stops to get themselves to school and then faced criticism the minute they go in because they're late or because they've not got their tie, as opposed to someone saying, how are you doing? You know, I know you haven't got a tie. Do you need a tie? It's as simple a fix as that. Do you need a minute to chat? As opposed to then facing this confrontation, because, you know, that child or young person is coming in with stress levels through the roof. And we all know we behave differently when we're stressed and anxious. We might be very withdrawn and tearful, but we might be very snappy and very irritable and quite angry, really. So it's like, you know, understanding that, you know, well, I think that's one of the other big things, but we'll come on to that in a minute, how we add something to that interaction in terms of our emotional state. But that whole understanding that, you know, from the looked after child perspective, who might be on their 2nd or 3rd to placement, might have experienced horrendous trauma before coming into care, you know, right through to the child, a lot of the children at the minute who may be very anxious because they might have worries or have heard that their parents are worried about relatives being ill or about catching the disease or about financial security, which are, you know, no less real, but hopefully more transient. So that was kind of the nature of the spectrum, I think.
Oh, so many different things that you've said in there. Yes, we'll definitely come on to the impact that the adults can have. But I think one of the things you beautifully do in the book is that you talk about the ordinary things that can happen to us, where, you know, we could be caught in a traffic jam on the way to work, having had an argument with our partner or something, and then we arrive at work, and now we can go back to work. At least we hope we can, although obviously we're making this film at this strange time, but it's going to be here for a while. You know, you arrive at school already somewhat churned up yourself, and you know what it takes to actually get concentrated for ourselves to be in the day, and how much more so if, as you say, you're a young person who's been looking after you are, as a young person, the carer. So what it takes for a teacher to be able to say, do you want a tie? Can I give you a tie? Or can I give you a couple of minutes? Do you need to chat for a couple of minutes? As opposed to, where's your tie? That means, you know, you're off to the head's room or whatever it is, or you're going to get a detention or whatever. The difference in approach of those two styles is really radical, isn't it? I suppose it's zero tolerance versus regarding the child or young person as a fellow human being who might have some other needs at that moment.
Yes, and I think, you know, in the book I talk about kind of, you know, a culture of care, because actually if we are thinking about treating children with kindness and compassion, and I think there's never a reason not to be kind. It just doesn't exist. Yes, you might have to talk about behaviour. Yes, there might need to be some restorative approaches, but there's never a reason not to be kind, because, you know, we are humans and we have to accept we're humans. It's not to say it's wrong that you feel churned up when you go into school because you've had an argument with your partner or your car didn't start, whatever, but it's about that acknowledgement that, I think there's a quote from Dr. Karen Treisman, isn't there? interaction is an intervention. And the idea that every time we are interacting with a child, there will be an impact from that, won't there? So if we haven't, if we are putting into that our emotional state, then that will obviously have an impact on the child. And that's where it comes back to that culture of care, because it should be perfectly acceptable in a team environment to say, actually, could you give me 5 minutes? Could you give me a minute? I just need, or could you take over here for a minute? And that's where there needs to be an understanding that from the head down, that is that kind of thing that needs setting, because I think there should always be tolerance. I think context always counts. And when you have a team of people that operate like that, then I think that creates much more inclusive environments for the young people, so that staff are prepared to say, actually, you know, I just need a minute here to sort my own. And I talk about kind of a moment of stillness, allowing yourself that time to kind of, you know, sort yourself out a little bit, just know where you are before you start interacting. Because we know, first of all, that the most vulnerable children are very good at picking up on adults' emotional states. So if we're anxious, if we're cross, if we're, you know, if our buttons are being pushed by their behaviour, that will impact our response, and then we set this kind of unhelpful cycle up, really.
Well, why do you think that is? Why do you think they're carrying that hypervigilance with them to our moods in such that way?
I think they're used to, if they've experienced trauma, I think their brain is very used to picking up and having to interpret. Well, I guess there's a lot of times they might not have felt very safe. So they're very alert to picking up, is this kind of a normal cue, or should I feel worried here? And if their experience has been when adults get charged, then that might have a negative impact on them. So thinking about kind of conflict, or not even necessarily violence, but, you know, sort of shouting and things like that, they might be very sensitive to that. So I think they're the ones that are very aware. But I also think we are all impacted by each other's emotions. You know, you could walk into a staff room and get a feeling in a second, couldn't you? You know, oh, they've just had the call, or something's happened, and you could just feel that without anybody opening their mouths, can't you? You know.
When you say the call, you mean Ofsted is on its way?
Yes, which is usually something that sends ripples around. Around staff rooms, but
you can see a certain pallor has arrived on everybody's faces.
Something's happening. Well, actually, I went to do some training in a school one day, not so long ago, twilight training, and I experienced that very definitely, man. I did notice a couple of police cars outside that gave me the heads up, but walking into the school in the hall, it was just, you know, whole school training, massive group of people in the hall. You could almost feel the tension. And I chatted to the head, and it was like, no, we've got to address this first, because there had been a very serious knife incident that day. So of course that had impacted all the students, impacted the teachers, who were having to contact lots of parents. And it's like, well, you know, we've got to kind of deal with this a bit, otherwise people are not going to be, exactly what we're saying, they're not going to be in a place where they can access learning if they've got all those emotions kind of, you know, going around.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think what you're saying is that before we can hope that the children will be able to settle to learn, it sounds like what you're saying, the staff need to be able to settle to teach.
Absolutely.
And somehow there has to be that caring culture that you talk about in the book, wrapped around the staff first and foremost. And that, yes, of course, we're professional. Yes, of course, we are expected to manage that and take responsibility for ourselves. But within a team culture, there's still a lot of space there for that to be a collaborative venture.
Absolutely. And the culture definitely needs to be one of acceptance and not blame, and understanding that as humans we make mistakes. And unfortunately, having worked in inclusion quite a bit and doing a little bit, you know, I've sat on an inordinate number of sort of governors' hearings and reviewed exclusion. And very often when incidents become quite serious, there's often times that you can see that actually if a slightly different thing had happened there, there could have been a different outcome. And then if another person had taken over at that point, because when you're looking at it, and some of these have been CCTV'd, and you can see, oh, I can just see that if someone else had stepped in there, that would have been different. And I think the people themselves would see that. You know, you would see that yourself if you look back, because we've all done it, haven't we? We've all had situations that we mishandle where we've just thought, you know, I'm going to win on this, and it becomes a bit of a battle. And as soon as it becomes a battle, we are just lost, and we will be, well, everyone will lose, not just ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah, so if there is a kind of culture of blame, then what do you think is the first step in the direction of moving towards a culture of care?
Well, I think unfortunately it probably has to come from the top, but I think challenging situations that are not, because I think we have a duty of care as educators. And I think obviously the way the care works is if you support your staff, they will be able to care for the children. But I think if the staff aren't feeling it, then I do feel they need to start taking that to their leadership. You know, that is a responsible professional thing. If we compare that, for example, to the cases that have just come up about abuse within care settings, actually, if we are seeing children being excluded because there is a wrong culture in the school, I think our duty as a professional is to raise that. Yes, that might have implications for us, but I feel it's a kind of moral human duty would be my
it's a kind of
view.
safeguarding issue.
Well, it certainly is, certainly,
Yes.
because when we exclude a student, we don't know what we're excluding them to always, do we? And so I think it is very much a safeguarding incident, it's a safeguarding issue, yeah.
I'm sure I can see your health visitor hat coming on there, Sheila, as well.
Quite probably, yeah.
It's like quick change artists with all your different hats. Okay, one of the things you also talk about in the book, which I think is really interesting, is about our scripts.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a bit? Because you are asking teachers to really look at their own behaviours. You're asking teachers to manage their emotions, and you do go into these things. You know, there's a lot of support for educational staff in your book. Lots of thoughts about how to do it, lots of reflective ideas and exercises. But talk to us a bit about what does that mean for you, scripts, and the need to change them. What's that about?
Yeah, and I guess that goes back to the culture and the idea of kindness. I think we get used to certain ways of talking, and I do think in the way that a lot of teachers have been trained, there's been an overemphasis on, well, I haven't read the book, so I'm not being critical in any way, but on kind of the notion of running the room, on being authoritative. And I'm not saying they're not important parts of teaching, but I think sometimes we can get quite an unhelpful language coming out of that, you know, that whole sit down, get in your chair, which, you know, I'm not saying that's never appropriate. And if it, you know, is a member of staff, whether it's a teacher or a teaching assistant, if you know the students, you know the ones where that will be okay and they will actually sit down and get on with it, and the ones where actually what they're telling you via their behaviour is, I'm not coping today, and they're going to need a slightly different approach. So I think the scripts are a way that as staff teams can work out more helpful things to say. So even if it's like, I can see you're struggling and I'll be with you in a minute, which is a bit different. Will you shut it while I get the class going or whatever? And, you know, much as I would like to think that that doesn't go on in schools, I have heard reported, you know, I think there are still schools where teachers shout. There are still schools where they'll stand in the corridor and say, look at me. Not usually the ones who want training. In my experience, they're usually quite well along the way, quite informed in terms of their, you know, their approach, being trauma informed and attachment aware. But there are plenty others where that is not the case, and it's very, and I think sometimes actually from central government we get that message. You know, certainly when we're talking about schools returning, it was a rhetoric of a crackdown on behaviour and this kind of thing, and I think that's not helpful. And I think it is good to have high aspirations about behaviour, but actually if these children haven't ever learned to manage their own emotions, they are going to struggle. And that was what I saw in FE colleges. They can't, and what we see amongst a lot of adults, you know, if they don't get that taught in school, they're going to be adults having children that still can't do that. So, you know, so I think scripts are just a helpful way of deciding to get yourself to have a bank of phrases, because if we've got into a habit of using certain language, and I think language very much can steer, it sort of comes a bit from our attitude, but it can steer our actions. So I think having much more helpful, positive things to say, or positive ways to script things, can just be quite a helpful tool. Yeah, because I think we're very habit bound and we get used to saying certain things, and you can hear sometimes it's no, stop it, don't do this, do that, and you hear it in Sainsbury's, don't you? And you want to say, oh, you know, just less of the negatives, let's try and do something positive. Yeah.
It's also about challenging internal scripts with children as well, isn't it? The sort of I'm no good at art kind of script. So I guess if we're more adept at finding a language that's going to be constructive and to reach children, we're going to be much more adept at when they are that much calmer. And because they trust us, because we've been really consistent and attuned to them in building relationship when they are that much calmer, of enabling them to think about their own internal language, let alone their external language, how they think about themselves.
Yes, I mean, I think there's 2 points there. I think we have to be aware that teachers want, adults wander around with lots of mindsets, don't we? Things we tell ourselves we're good at, we're not good at. And I think some are, if you've once had an experience as a teacher of perhaps a manager saying you don't manage behaviour well or something like that, then I think you're battling against that feeling that you need to kind of be the strong person in the room, which I think can give rise to lots of unhelpful anxiety in the adult. And we're back to that kind of cycle. But I think when it comes to children as well, what we know is about some of our vulnerable children, one of the things they struggle with generally across the board is their self-esteem. And often they won't have had a lot of chance of positives. And I cannot emphasize enough the experience of failing every day in school must be terrible. And
Absolutely.
when I mentioned before about the children that can't read, imagine every day pitching up at school, feeling like you're a big fat failure because you cannot read the text in front of you and being presented with text on every single lesson.
Yes, I can't imagine many adults persisting in going to a class in a language that they keep not being able to understand and managing the humiliation and the shame and the feeling of exclusion and the feeling of just wanting to, I mean, it's a bit like, you know, when your computer goes wrong, and I don't know about you, I want to weep and I want someone else to just come and do it.
Throw it out the window.
Yeah, and you know, imagine having to have that feeling every day and just somehow not getting it. And if you're then, even if you're punished because you're seen as not being able to, maybe it's because you're not concentrating, well, maybe you're faffing around because you're doing anything to distract from the fact that you can't do this. And you know, it just kind of feels, if we could imagine ourselves into that situation, how agonizing to have to do that every single day. What a battle to set up.
One of the things I sometimes do in training is get people to spell some really difficult words and write them with their non-dominant hand. Now, it doesn't work quite so well on Zoom, but when you're in live training, you can see that some people, because again, the ones that think, oh my goodness, no, I hate spelling, I'm terrible at spelling, because there's always this assumption as a teacher you'll be good at spelling. So it's quite and good at maths. And of course, you know, not everyone is. And even though it's just a tiny, almost quite fun activity, that feeling that, you know, you'll almost see some people do this, and you'll see some people when they get it right, they go, yes, because they kind of have to let everyone know they've got it right, which is okay, you know, but it's like that experience of success is very different from the experience of failure. And I think when we think about our vulnerable children, we need to be thinking all the time of how can we give them an experience of success, because that's the thing. I mean, words are important, being told things is important, but actually experiencing it, you know, I did that, is massively powerful.
That sense of self-efficacy, the sense of satisfaction, the sense of arrival at a new stage. I mean, we know kids are doing it, of course, with their computer games and so forth, but if it translates into the environment, then one becomes like it's into the school environment. That can feel like, oh, it's a hostile place, I don't like it, I'd rather be outside getting those satisfactions somewhere else. So even more important that they can find it in school in some kind of way. Yes, you were talking about the shouting, and I think there's so much evidence from neuroscience that as soon as we shout and the aggression levels rise, then people's capacity to hear goes down. So if you're shouting, listen to me, it's actually having completely the opposite effect. It can't be done. It can't be done. I'm guessing then you're not you know, you talked about saying some children, you need to know which children are going to respond to. Now, come on, sit down, get on with it. Some children will be able to respond to that because they trust you, whereas other children absolutely won't. So that sounds like you're really differentiating here, just as you would with a learning difficulty. You're differentiating around what the behaviour has told you that their need is.
And I think that's really important. I think, you know, we do have a statutory duty to make reasonable adjustments, and I think we've made very good reasonable adjustments when it comes to academic ability, cognitive ability, and even certain defined SEN you know, conditions. I think what we've not been so good at doing is making reasonable adjustments for children where it is a social and emotional. And I cannot tell you how many personal education plan meetings I've sat in where people have all acknowledged that this child might be 15 or 10 or 5, but actually they're functioning at a level much below that in terms of their
emotional age is much younger than their chronological age.
That's right, but then they're expected to behave just like their peers, and it's like, well, we're saying they haven't got those skills socially and emotionally, and yet we're saying, you know, to a 5-year-old sit on the carpet for half an hour or 20 minutes or whatever, or we're expecting a 7-year-old to go out on the playground and be able to manage relationships when we've already said they can't do that. So, you know, we've been a bit slow, I think, in making reasonable adjustments for kind of the more hidden things, the social and emotional things that you know, it's not like you have to walk around with a, you know, a plaster on your leg or something. It's not visible in the same way, except it is, because it's about behavior. But then we haven't had that understanding that, you know, the impact of early trauma on the brain and of attachment issues on the brain means that these children don't have the skills and the neural pathways that others do. So it's not that they're being difficult. Sometimes they just can't do things. And if a child couldn't, I think I mentioned one of these in the book, you know, if a child climbed up a climbing frame and didn't have the skills to get it down, we wouldn't leave them stranded, would we?
No, we wouldn't tell it off for not being able to climb
And
down.
we wouldn't say, yeah, exactly, well, I'm going to leave you there, because that would just be, and the same if a child couldn't tie their shoelaces, we wouldn't let them go out and trip over on the playground. We'd do it for them, teach them how to do it, support them till they can do it. And yet with behaviour, it seems to be, well, we're just going to look at the behaviour. In some schools, absolutely not in every school at all. There are some brilliant nurturing schools, but you know, let's look at what's behind that and give you the skills you need. In fact, again, I was just responding to a tweet about behaviour management, about anger management actually, and my thought was actually, well, let's not think about the anger, think about how they're regulating all of their emotions, because actually if they can't do that, then that's what they need to learn. And I think that's more helpful to think about, what do we need to teach them, what's the bit they can't do, and then we have to do that. So certainly when it comes to regulation, it's about them having enough opportunities to co-regulate with a calm adult, so that they can then, you know, learn ultimately how to regulate, or we will churn them out being adults that find society very difficult, and we know the adults that do. And sadly, the pathway is they will often end up in you know, for places like prisons, mental health institutions, or living in society but having an awful lot of problems. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. So when you were wanting to write the book, what were you really hoping at, kind of core, the essence of what you were hoping that people will get from it by reading your book?
I think for school staff and teachers in particular, and understanding that what I suppose that children aren't necessarily always being willful. That's not to say they're not, that there's not some. It's about really, are they getting their needs met outside school? Because if they are, then generally speaking, they will be the ones who will be engaged. They might have odd days, as I say, back to that spectrum of trouble, when they need a bit of support. But generally speaking, they'll be okay. But there are other children where really they are coming into school, and what they need are their needs meeting. And until they have their attachment needs, their self-esteem needs met, they are not going to be able to be in a place to learn. And so we might say, and I think there's been a growing understanding recently amongst teachers that, you know, we're not asking school staff to be therapists with a capital T.
That's so important.
But what we are saying, as a human person, the relationship you have with that child can be therapeutic. And that doesn't mean you have to be anything other than a human being who is kind and compassionate. So I think it was that understanding that, you know, let's think about what might have happened to that child before they got to school that day. What might have happened to that child earlier in their life? And, you know, sometimes if we get schools to think about some of their most challenging children, and they might not know their early years, but they can often have a bit of a stab about it because of what they see in the relationships with parents as they come to collect them, what they might know that children report, that parents report. And it gives you a bit of an indication of that maybe their needs have not always been met consistently or sufficiently enough.
So Sheila, what do you say to people who will say, well, it's all very well saying that we need to differentiate according to the child's need at that time, but surely, I know that some people will say, surely they really have to learn that actually they've got to just comply, because otherwise when they're out in the real world, no one's going to be thinking about their needs. So surely, and you know, it creates disruption for the others in the class. It has a strong impact on the teachers. So how do you respond to the person who says, are you really going to let them get away with it?
I think it's about the letting them get away with it, really. I think there has to be an understanding that a child that is not behaving well on an ongoing, repeated basis is usually quite distressed. It's not nice to feel very angry, to feel unhappy, to feel like you can't engage in what the other children are doing. And, you know, even hurting other children, I think... my little grandson was here at the weekend, and he's reading The Boy at the Back of the Class in school, and we were just talking about this character Brendan the bully, who I believe is in there, although I haven't read the book yet. It is on my list. And he was saying what you have to understand is sometimes you know, bullies are people that actually are quite hurt themselves inside, which I just thought was a great example. But I think it's about understanding that we are not saying it's okay, we are never saying it's okay, but what we're saying is we need to help you manage those responses. So if we just constantly concentrate on the behavior and sanctioning it, we're not actually doing anything that's going to teach them the skills they need. Now, teaching them the skills they need is going to take time. So it's a bit like punishing a child because they can't write the letter B properly. It's actually what they need to do is have someone, you know, they need to have them written and go over them. They need to have lines, they need to practice, they need support. And to me, when it comes to behavior, it's like, well, the behavior is one thing, but what happened that made that child do that? What made them very stressed? What were they anxious about? Why did they feel that, you know, that other child was being a threat, or why were they so out of control that they had to do that? So I think it's never ever saying that that behavior is okay. It's still holding that high aspiration, but accepting that these children, certain children, are going to need quite a pathway to get there, because they have to learn things they've not learned. I mean, in many ways, some of it is a bit like if they'd got that when they were 2 and 3, when they were first managing those emotions, if they'd had that kind of, that coaching, that love, that support, that experience of co-regulating with a calm adult, they might have learned some of those. But if they haven't learned them, then actually our job is to create situations where they can teach them. Now, sometimes, and I have no problem with the fact that sometimes children need to be removed from the classroom. Absolutely appropriate at times. It's what we do when we remove them from the classroom, because unless we do something, we're going to put them back in and the same thing's going to happen. But if we take them out and we teach them, well, actually, you know, when I'm feeling like this is what I do. Next time you feel like that, stick your hand up, raise this card, come and see me, and we'll try doing this instead, or whatever it happens to be for that child. Yeah.
So
or young person.
It's not just put you in the isolation room to think about it, because actually
No.
they wouldn't be able to think about anything themselves.
No.
It's something about extending the range, extending the strategies, and being with them in that time. Yeah. And you talked about modeling in the book. Can you tell us a bit about, you know, modeling and teachers' need to model, really?
Yeah, I think what a lot of what we'd class as vulnerable children haven't had are adults who are able, for often very good reasons, to kind of teach them how to manage their own emotions. And I think sometimes we see children have, well, we know with little children they have a very small range of emotions they could describe and articulate. So I think part of one of the things I mentioned in the book is about developing a shared emotional language, and part of that is teachers being able to role model. So having those simple conversations that say, I think that left you feeling really frustrated. You know, I think you found the work hard and you're frustrated, and that's why you got quite angry. What I do when I feel frustrated is do this. And then at other times, you know, being honest with the class and saying, do you know, I've had a terrible morning. We're just going to take a minute. Yeah. And we're all just going to sit down and be quiet and do whatever. Yeah. Or we're going to stand up and sing a song, or we're going to do some stretching, and actually being, you know, giving them things they might be able to add to their own arsenal and their own kind of, you know, range of strategies. Yeah.
Yeah, so in a sense, you're modeling it by saying, I too have feelings that I find unmanageable, and here I am demonstrating what I'm doing to regulate that feeling, and maybe even inviting suggestions from people. You never know what you might get.
Absolutely.
To help you manage your feelings better as an adult. Because teaching is a deeply stressful job, and as a virtual school head, but also being in the school milieu in general, you will have been subject to the impact of teaching. What do you think are the worst impacts of teaching, and what do you think, in your book, what kind of things are you advocating for teachers to do to support themselves and each other in that?
I mean, I think the two biggest impacts are kind of the level of stress. And I think one of the big stressors are these challenging children. And certainly going into schools as a virtual head, I've honestly seen staff teams pretty demolished by the behaviours of some children that are very, very needy. And what we know is there probably aren't enough specialist provisions. There probably isn't enough support. There isn't enough funding very often for support. So that's very tough. And I think the whole workload and pressures on teachers is enormous. You know, I do not know a teacher who would work, under something like 50 or 60 hours a week. It's incessant, it's tough. And I think that, so therefore, I think teachers historically, we've not been very good at looking after ourselves. And there needs to be an understanding that if we're not really hot on our own self-care, we will find it very hard to give emotionally what the children need.
Absolutely, because we progressively would get closed down, don't we, really, if we don't take that stress seriously.
Yeah, and I think, and we see, you know, retention within teaching is a very real problem. And that goes back to that whole priority of well-being, which goes back to the SLT, because I think sometimes SLTs are very rightly concerned about the children, but actually if they were supporting their staff, creating cultures that were without blame, and I've certainly seen some heads tweet, you know, that in terms of reducing workload, if something isn't adding value, thinking why are we doing it, because there's been a bit of an obsession with gathering evidence, and we do need evidence. I'm not saying we don't, you know, but sometimes it's been gathered in triplicate and done this way and done that way, and thinking what's the most most time efficient way for staff to do that. And staff are, you know, creative, you know, getting them to think, well, what is it that we do that adds to your pressure? And which are the things that we could move? And I think one of the pluses that's come out of this recent situation is I've seen lots of schools doing that and stopping doing certain things, so they've got time to do certain other things. Yeah.
What do you think, just as a sort of brief aside really, but you know, just setting your book, well, you're in the context of where we are, which is just at the time of schools returning, some areas maybe having to close down again, some individuals maybe having to close down again, a huge time of uncertainty for all of us, and living through a lot of ambiguity of losses going on at the moment, and some people having actual tangible losses as well.
Yes.
If we just sort of step into that terrain for a moment, how do you think your book particularly can help people at this time?
I think it's I think it'd be very helpful, because I think if we talk about the spectrum of trouble, there will be some children in the school where this is a transient, minimal experience because they've had parents who can nurture and support them through it. There will be others where this has been quite a major experience, like you say, and you know, so I think following through the book in terms of strategies to use with children, if we just think about that whole level of anxiety and loss, which are some of the things that I mentioned in the spectrum of trouble, I think people would find it very helpful.
And for me, I think one of the things in your book that's useful is this thing about modelling, ironically, because as the adults, we have to stay in a good enough state to be able to give the children hope, actually, that one can still grow things, even at a time of uncertainty and restriction and a narrowing and a changing of our entire way of being. We can, in fact, schools can be such a brilliant place for nurturing something that is growing and moving and thriving at the same time and despite. And I think your book is a very positive book, which is a really lovely thing, and I hope that that's what people might gain from it if they were arriving at it now. And I think you were also quite ahead of the curve in terms of addressing some of the things that now, when we look at adverse childhood experience research, this is all in here really, perhaps not by those words, but you are talking about the impact of a whole range of different experiences. One of the things that I remember you've talked about in here is about things like children who are refugee children or asylum seeking children, or also children who might have a parent in prison or a parent serving overseas with the forces. And I think sometimes those children get a bit ignored or overlooked, or that whole massive other issue of a big loss going on. And I'm thinking through COVID, people have also had experience of parents becoming unemployed who've never been unemployed before, parents perhaps suddenly using food banks, which creates a lot of issues. And so these situations, which are kind of quite rare but can still be swallowed by the children, either directly or by absorbing the adults' anxiety around them. So your spectrum has got even more markers on it, really, hasn't it?
But I also think you mentioned a really important thing there, which was hope. And I do feel in this situation we have, and I think lots of schools are feeling this, you know, we've had a school system that I think has been a bit one size fits all, and we knew it didn't fit all. And I think we have a little bit of a chance to shift things. And I think there has been quite a helpful shift towards understanding that well-being is massively important. And actually, without taking care of well-being, and most parents and most teachers, you know, if they don't get their GCSEs, that's okay. But actually, if they're unwell or mentally ill or they are self-harming, then actually that, you know, that is not what we'd want for children. So it is right that is a priority for everyone. And actually, it's only when we get that well-being bit right that they'll be able to achieve what they're capable of academically. And I think for a long time we've just thought, oh, if we just keep, you know, cracking the whip metaphorically, keeping them working, raising the aspirations, and it doesn't work. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity now, like you say, to maybe redress some balances, have a bit of a rethink. And I'm sure during these times, I know a lot of adults that have thought a lot about their own self-care more overtly than they have before, and that's got to be a win, hasn't it? Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people's mental health might have taken a knock as well, but you know, there are also you know, a greater sort of awareness, I think, how much we need to take care of ourselves.
When you're working in schools, what are your best ways for taking care of yourself? Because we know that, the teachers are adults who are also going through the COVID and post-COVID or post-lockdown 1 and possibly before lockdown 2, possibly having multiple drop-offs of their own children at other schools even before they arrive at their own school. I mean, so many challenges. I think educational staff should be rewarded to the heavens really at the moment, along with your ex-NHS colleagues. But what are your top tips when you're working in education? What are your top tips for your self-care, Sheila?
Well, I think it actually goes back to mindset. I think you have to believe that you are worth looking after. And I think sometimes we tend to go down this mindset that my needs are the bottom of the pile. And actually your needs can be the bottom of the pile for a little while. And I know I've had some interesting discussions with parents of quite severely SEND children where they've been looking after them alone and often having very little support. And it's very difficult for them to ever look after themselves. But I think the mindset is an important bit, that actually if you do not look after yourself, you will not be able to support the children or your family. And indeed, it's not going to do anyone any good if you kind of go under in any way. But I think that does make the onus a bit on us. We have a bit of a responsibility to fit in, and it doesn't have to be long stuff. There's this lovely little infographic that I tweeted about, like 5-minute self-care. Just go and have a quiet coffee in the garden, just go and have a bit of a walk outside. When you go home, decide you're just going to take half an hour to go outside, read a book. The things that help you feel better. The danger is that we can get into very unhelpful spirals of not doing it. The busier we get, the less likely we are to do it, and that's when we need it the most. There's another Dalai Lama quote, I think, about you should meditate for 10 minutes a day unless you're really busy, and then it should be 20 or something like that. But of course what happens is we don't do it, do we? Because we end up being really busy, and it's just when you need it the most.
I love the Dalai Lama. It's amazing, isn't it? It's like, think, oh damn it, yeah, that's probably right.
Yeah, there you go.
So
and of course when we're busy, we stop all of those things. We stop going for walks, we stop meeting mates. Well, that's a bit challenging anyway. We stop doing the things that keep us well, and we know the consequences physically and emotionally.
And we have to do them even when we don't feel like doing them, because then afterwards we think, oh, I'm glad I did that. But it doesn't. Yes. You can't just wait for the motivation to arrive. You've got to do it first.
No,
the motivation arrives afterwards. So okay, just come on then. You managed to neatly avoid the question. What are the 3 top things that you do?
Okay, I try
to look after yourself very briefly.
I try to walk daily, and I am lucky because I live near 3 different woods, so fields and woods, and I find trees are the most calming thing. I usually I have a set of good mates that I have regular contact with, where we talk quite, and that makes, and I can feel it if I haven't seen them, if that makes sense. And I every day do things that I enjoy, whether that is sitting having a meal with my husband in the evening, watching some television, contacting other members of family by Zoom, or even a long hot bath, whatever. But I think you've got to think, what are the things that I like, because that is putting back in, really.
It's restorative, isn't it? Even if it's a small thing, it actually means a lot, and it's worth every minute in terms of what you've got got in the tanks to give.
Yes.
Okay, so just finally, I'd just like to ask you, are you a natural writer? Do you like writing? Was it
I love writing,
or did it flow for you?
I just love writing. In fact, I've just written a load of blogs about the things we've been talking about, like regulation, well-being, connection in the classroom, and it's just for pleasure. They're just on my website. I absolutely love writing. I feel like I'm kind of ready to start writing again. I feel there's lots of areas I'd like to sort of explore, really. So
what's your next area of focus?
Well, I feel very I mentioned before, I think I'm thinking about this more, about the whole impact of disability, being a disabled person, a learning disabled person, and thinking back over my sister's experiences, because she's older than me, never had a day of education in her life, because it was deemed, well, and my parents were told, put her in a home, forget about her, because that's what it was. But that was honest. That was, at least we knew what people thought. Whereas now we say every child deserves an education, but look how many SEND children are out of education, which is quite hypocritical. Whereas at least then I feel, well, they were honest, so they didn't feel it was worth educating people like my sister. I think it's a wrong decision, but that was their honest decision. Whereas now it's like, let's educate these children, and as I say, an awful lot of SEN children end up out of education,
because education can't accommodate them.
No, there's just not enough. And the whole inclusion agenda, I think we've got to be, we don't get the voice of people with disabilities enough, because I'm sure some people with disabilities and children with disabilities want to be included in mainstream society. society and mainstream schools. We know that the reality is not always very pleasant for a lot, and we know that, for example, a lot of adults with disabilities end up living in, when they close down community care homes, long stay institutions, they often were housed on really quite sink estates and had incredibly terrible times, and even now being cuckooed by quite terrible people. So so I think I'd love to start exploring that within the context of our society, really.
Great. Well, good luck with that. So thanks very much indeed for talking today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.